The agreement that arrived at Hewitt Park on the 17th of November had, as the family's solicitor would later note with some discomfort, a single notable omission, and it was the omission that, in the end, rearranged everything. I want to tell you about it, if you will sit with me a little while. There is enough wood on this fire for the telling, and I have not yet found a story worth keeping that did not become clearer once said aloud. The agreement was drawn up between his lordship, the Viscount Dunvale, and Sir Clifford Hewitt, Baronet, of Hewitt Park in the county of Westmere. Its terms were, on the surface, straightforward. The Viscount would bring his considerable social standing and his unencumbered estate to bear on a particular matter of Sir Clifford's social debt. A delicate situation involving an outstanding obligation to a fellow member of his club, one that had grown indelicate over a number of years and required for its resolution precisely the sort of backing that a Viscount could provide and a baronet could not. In exchange, Sir Clifford would offer one of his daughters for the Viscount's consideration in marriage, one of his daughters, not the elder, not the younger, one. The agreement named no Christian name. It specified only a daughter of the Hewitt household, which was, in the strict usage of any honest solicitor, a phrase that applied to either of Sir Clifford's two unmarried daughters equally. I should tell you at once that the Viscount's own solicitor had noticed the omission and had raised it with some care. His lordship had acknowledged it without concern and declined to correct it, saying only that he preferred to attend to that particular detail in person. Sir Clifford, reading the agreement in his study at Hewitt Park, did not notice the omission at all. He had two daughters. One was generally acknowledged, from Westmere to London, to be a beauty of the first order. The other ran his household, kept his correspondence, and had not, in his particular reckoning, been a serious candidate for anything so promising as a Viscount since she was 19. The agreement, whatever its precise language, obviously referred to Lavinia. That was the only sensible reading. That was how the world worked, and Sir Clifford was a man who had always trusted the world to work in the way he expected it to. He did not mention the agreement to his elder daughter. He did not, in fact, mention the Viscount to her at all. Now I have told a great many stories from beside this fire, and I will tell you plainly, I do not deal in simple contrasts. The world rarely sorts itself into angels and their opposites, and I find the stories that pretend it does are the ones that leave you feeling least satisfied when the last coal goes dark. Miss Lavinia Hewitt was 22, and she was beautiful in the way of a person who has never once looked in a mirror and been disappointed by what she found there. She was not unkind. She was not calculating in the manner of villains. She was simply a young woman who had been told by every gesture and glance the world had ever sent her way that her face was her fortune, and who had drawn from this the entirely rational conclusion that the clever thing to do was to spend it well before time made the spending less advantageous. She received the news of the Viscount's impending visit with a brightness that was, if you listened carefully, rather more anxious than it appeared. The brightness of a girl who understood, at some level she never quite put into words, that she had one asset the world consistently priced highly, and that its value was not guaranteed to remain stable, and that this particular buyer was the most eligible one, likely to present himself before the market shifted. Miss Theodora Hewitt was 27, and she was the other daughter. She was the one who managed the household accounts. She was the one who organized the larder and corresponded with the tradespeople and sat with the cook when the cook was unwell and made certain the fires were laid in the right rooms before a guest arrived. She had a face that was, by the conventions of her time, insufficiently remarkable to draw attention, strong-boned, composed with the kind of steadiness in it that people mistake for plainness when they are not paying close enough attention. She was not plain. She was simply the sort of woman who becomes invisible when there is someone more immediately decorative nearby, the way a well-made window frame disappears. The moment there is a view, the moment She had found the agreement as she found most things of consequence in Hewitt Park, while doing something that had nothing to do with it. She was reorganizing her father's correspondence, as she did every month, because he never organized it himself, and the document had been lying, unguarded and unconcerned, beneath a copy of the Racing Gazette. She had read it standing alone in the cold study, and she had understood the omission, immediately, with the same quick practical clarity she brought to every problem she was given, and a number she was not. She understood, too, without needing to examine the understanding in any more detail than was bearable, exactly why her father had not thought to discuss the matter with her. A daughter of the Hewitt household meant Lavinia. Of course it meant Lavinia. Theodora was 27 and unremarkable and extremely, permanently, comprehensively useful, and useful things were kept, not given away to Viscounts. She put the agreement back, where she had found it, exactly as she had found it, and she went on preparing Hewitt Park for the Viscount's arrival, because someone had to see to the linens and the menu and the arrangement of the rooms, and that someone was, as it had always been, her. She did not, even in the very private hours of her own company, permit herself to wonder what it might feel like to be the daughter a Viscount came to see. The Viscount Dunvale arrived in Westmere 2 days before he was expected. I want you to understand his reasons, because they matter to the whole shape of what follows. Lord Gareth Dunvale was not a man who enjoyed performing his intentions before they were formed. He was methodical rather than secretive, careful rather than cold, though people who did not know him well were prone to mistaking the one for the other. He had a son of 4 years old at Dunvale House, and a late wife whose memory he carried, with the particular weight of a man who had neither idealized the marriage nor dismissed it, and he had arrived at the agreement with Sir Clifford, not from desperation but from a practical acknowledgement that his son needed a mother, and he was not on his own, managing that particular aspect of things with any great success. The financial terms you should understand plainly, because I dislike confusion on that point. The Viscount was not in any financial difficulty. His estates were sound, his income was reliable, and the social matter belonging to Sir Clifford was one he was resolving as a favour. There had been a long-standing friendship between his own late father and Sir Clifford, and certain obligations do not expire simply because one generation passes to the next. He had means enough and to spare. What he lacked was time and clear-headedness and a sound sense of the woman he might be asking to share the raising of a small boy who had grown very quiet in the 14 months since his mother's death. There was also this: Miss Theodora Hewitt held, from her maternal grandmother's estate, a trust of some substance that would be released upon her marriage, and would benefit the Dunvale lands in the next generation considerably. This was a practical matter, and a real one, and the Viscount was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it. But it was separate from the question of which daughter he intended to speak to, and I want that separation to be clear before we go any further. He had checked into the village inn at Westmere under his family name rather than his title, not as any elaborate disguise, but simply because he had found over the years that titles attracted performances, and he was not in the market for a performance. He had given his name as Mr. Dunvale, which was accurate as far as it went, and no one in Westmere had any particular reason to connect a quietly dressed gentleman of 35 with the Viscount of Dunvale, whose affairs had never been the primary subject of any Westmere conversation. He wanted to see the family as it actually was, not as it would arrange itself when it knew he was watching. He did not have to wait long for the first opportunity. On the morning of the second day, walking through the village with no particular purpose, he came upon a small bookseller's shop on the main street, the kind of narrow, crowded establishment that smells of old paper and good intention, and went in, as he usually did with such places, to look. He was in the back corner, examining a shelf of natural histories, when the bell above the door announced 2 more customers. He heard the younger one first. Her voice was light and carried easily. "You truly do not need to come in, Teddy. I am only looking at the fashion journals, and you always end up in the back with the dull books, and I am left standing alone at the counter, feeling like someone's poor relation." "You are never poor," said the other voice, lower and rather drier, "and you have never felt like a relation of anyone's, poor or otherwise. I am simply saying you needn't come every time. You could wait on the bench." "I could," agreed the second voice. "But then who would remind you that Mrs. Pettigrew's lending subscription renews this week, and she asked us to collect the volume she reserved?" A brief silence, suggesting that Mrs. Pettigrew's lending subscription had not factored into the younger sister's planning. Gareth Dunvale did not move from the natural histories. He turned a page of a book he was not reading. "I shall be quick," the younger voice conceded. "You are never quick in a shop," said the elder quite pleasantly. "I have planned accordingly." He heard the younger girl move toward the front counter. He heard the elder move, with a quieter tread, toward the bookshelves some feet away, around the corner of the middle stacks. What followed was not conducted loudly. They were sisters who had grown up sharing thin walls and small rooms, and they spoke in the low tones of people accustomed to being overheard and uninterested in providing more material than necessary. But the shop was narrow, and the back room was quiet. And he caught most of it, and the parts he caught stayed with him. The younger sister had circled back, while the shopkeeper went for the reserved volume. They were standing just around the corner from him, close enough that he could hear the soft rustle of a coat, the particular sound of someone leaning against a shelf. "Do you think he will like me?" Miss Lavinia said. A pause. "Then I think he will find you very easy to like." "That isn't quite what I asked." "No," agreed the elder quietly. "It isn't." Another pause. "Teddy, do you think this will work?" "I think," said the elder. And her voice carried a note he found himself listening to with far more attention than he had intended. A note that was not resignation, not precisely, but something close to the weariness of a person who has held a very heavy thing for a very long time and has become so accustomed to the weight that she no longer sets it down, even when her hands are free. "I think that you are very beautiful, and that the world has always rewarded beauty before most other things, and that this arrangement will most likely to proceed exactly as Papa expects it to. And if he is dull," Lavinia said, in the tone of someone who had entertained this possibility and made certain accommodations for it. "Then you shall manage," said the elder. "And if he is unkind—" A longer pause. "I would rather you did not marry an unkind man," the elder said at last. "I would rather you married a man who saw you as a person and not as an acquisition, however fine." "That is very easy to say," Lavinia replied, not cruelly, but with the practical confidence of someone who has thought this through. "The world is not arranged for romantic principles, Teddy. You know that better than I do." "I know that the world is not arranged fairly," the elder said. "That is not quite the same as saying its arrangements are worth repeating." "You are impossibly principled," Lavinia said, with what sounded like genuine, if baffled, affection, for someone who has never once been in a position to act on any of it. The silence that followed was the kind that does not require sound to be felt. "I would rather be needed for what I can do," the elder said, very quietly, "than wanted for how I look. At least what I can do will still be true in 20 years. The shopkeeper returned. The conversation closed. The two sisters collected the reserved volume, paid and left, and the bell above the door rang twice and went still. Gareth Dunvale stood in the back corner of the bookseller's shop, with a natural history he had not read a word of, and felt, settling through him with the quiet certainty of a thing he had not been expecting to find so quickly, the unmistakable sense that he had just heard the most honest sentence spoken in his presence in some considerable time. He presented himself at Hewitt Park on the appointed morning, arriving in his own carriage with his own title as the arrangements required. Sir Clifford came out to meet him with the flushed, expansive energy of a man watching his own difficulty resolve itself at the end of a long drive. Lady Hewitt waited in the doorway, and in the hall, arranged with some care, stood the family. Miss Lavinia Hewitt was in the front of the group. She wore a gown of deep rose, and she wore it with the unconscious authority of a young woman who has never once doubted that she belongs at the center of any room she enters. She was everything Sir Clifford's letter had implied, and everything every conversation about the Hewitt family had mentioned first. She smiled with a precision that would have been entirely convincing to anyone who had not, the previous morning, heard her ask her sister whether a Viscount was likely to be dull. Miss Theodora Hewitt stood behind her, and to the side, in a gown of soft grey wool, carrying nothing, expecting nothing, watching with an expression of composed attention that he recognized as the face of a woman who has learned, across many years and many similar halls, that the interesting thing happening in any given room is not happening to her. He received Sir Clifford's welcome with courtesy. He inclined his head to Lady Hewitt. He looked at Miss Lavinia Hewitt for a moment, long enough to be polite, and then he turned deliberately to the woman standing behind her. "Miss Theodora Hewitt," he said. It was not a question. She met his gaze with a composure that he found, privately, considerably more arresting than the carefully constructed reception he had just been offered. She had not been expecting to be addressed. She had been expecting, as she had been expecting for most of her adult life, to be looked past. "I have reviewed the terms of my agreement with your father," he said quietly, and though he did not raise his voice, in the stillness of that hall, his words reached every ear in it. "The agreement specifies a daughter of this household as candidate for my stand mission. I am given to understand, Miss Hewitt, that there is a trust from your maternal grandmother's estate held in your name as the elder daughter, accessible upon your marriage." This was not a point your father thought to raise explicitly. A brief pause. I thought it worth raising myself. The silence that followed had a quality I have come to know across a great many of these stories. The particular silence of a room full of people who believed they understood the arrangement of things, and discover, all at once, that they were wrong. Sir Clifford opened his mouth and produced no sound. Lady Hewitt's hands tightened around one another. Miss Lavinia went very still, the rose gown and the careful smile held in place by will alone, while everything she had assumed fell quietly to pieces behind her eyes. Miss Theodora Hewitt looked at the Viscount Dunvale, and she understood, in a moment that felt suspended and rather vertiginous, that the omission in the agreement had not been careless at all. "You knew," she said very quietly, low enough that only he could hear it. "Before you came here, you already knew which daughter the omission left room for." "I knew," he said just as quietly, "that the trust was held in your name. I did not know until yesterday morning which daughter I wished to speak to." She held his gaze for a long moment. "You were in Warwick's bookshop," she said. "I was in the natural history section," he said. "I was not reading." She was quiet, absorbing this. Then, with the steadiness he was beginning to understand, was her natural register for things that mattered. "You should have made yourself known." "I should have," he agreed. "I find I am more comfortable with what I heard than with the method by which I heard it. That will have to be enough honesty for the moment." He asked for a private conversation that afternoon, and she agreed. And they sat in the small room off the study, where she kept the household accounts. A cold, practical room fitted out for work rather than comfort, which told him something he found he was glad to know. He told her everything plainly. His son's name was William, he was 4 years old, and he had his mother's colouring and his father's tendency toward silence, and he had stopped asking when his mother was coming home approximately 6 months ago, which was somehow, the Viscount said, quieter and harder to bear than when he had asked every single day. He told her about the agreement with her father and about the trust, and he was careful to explain clearly that the social obligation he was resolving for Sir Clifford was entirely separate from his interest in the marriage. That he was not coming to Hewitt Park in any financial difficulty of his own, and that the trust was relevant to the long-term benefit of the estate his son would one day inherit. He wanted her to understand the mechanics without ambiguity, because he already suspected she was a woman who found ambiguity more unsettling than difficult truths. And then he told her what he had heard in the bookseller's shop. "You said you would rather be needed for what you can do than wanted for how you look," he said. "You said that what you can do would still be true in 20 years. He paused. "I have spent the past year," he said, "attempting to find a suitable candidate for a second marriage by attending the correct dinners and speaking to the correct families and meeting the correct young women as they were presented to me in the correct manner. And I have found—" He stopped, and something in his careful, composed face shifted slightly, the way a well-kept surface shifts when the thing underneath it moves. "I have found that I am entirely unable to determine, from a dinner table and a formal introduction, whether the woman across from me has any real substance to her, whether she is the kind of person who would sit with a 4-year-old boy who has gone very quiet and understand what the quiet means." Miss Theodora Hewitt looked at him steadily. "That is not something you can determine from a bookshop either," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is a better starting point than a dinner table." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness he was already coming to recognize as the particular register in which she delivered things that actually mattered, "I want to tell you something, Your Lordship, before I give you any answer. I want to tell you something honest, because I think you have just been very honest with me, and I believe it deserves a response in kind." "Please," he said. "I am not," she said, "the woman you may have constructed from an overheard sentence on a Wednesday morning. I am not serene. I am not particularly patient except by practice, which is a different thing entirely. I am 27 years old and I have spent the whole of my adult life being useful that has never once applied the same word to me that it applies to my sister. The word valuable, Your Lordship. Not useful, valuable." She looked down for a moment, then back up, with the steadiness of someone who has decided that this particular truth is going to be spoken and has organized herself to speak it. "I am tired. I am lonely in the way that is difficult to explain to people who have never been surrounded by family and still found themselves somehow entirely alone in it. And I would very much like—" A pause. "I would very much like to be somewhere that I am chosen for something other than my willingness to manage the larder and post the correspondence." She drew a breath. "I do not want you to choose me, because I said one right thing in a bookseller's shop. I want you to know, if you do choose me, what you are actually choosing: a woman who is occasionally quite cross, who will tell you when something is not working before it has stopped working, which some people find useful and others find exhausting, who will sit with your son, not because it is charming to be good with children, but because a child who has gone quiet is a problem I will want to understand, and I generally do not stop trying to understand a problem until I have." She folded her hands in her lap. "That is who I am. Not a saint, not a romantic principle. A person who would rather be needed for what she can do. You should know what you are considering." And the unmistakable air of a woman. Gareth Dunvale looked at the woman across from him, and something in his expression that had been carefully managed for some considerable time stopped being managed. "I did not come to Westmere to find a saint," he said. "I have met a great many saints on dinner-table circuits, and none of them struck me as particularly suited to a 4-year-old boy who has gone very quiet." He looked at her directly. "I came here because an agreement needed concluding and a decision needed making, and I came early because I have learned, at some personal cost, the difference between what a person is when they are performing and what they are when they believe no one of consequence is watching. What I heard in that bookshop was not a performance." He paused. "A woman who says she would rather be needed for what she can do than wanted for how she looks," he said, "is telling me, with considerable clarity, what kind of marriage she is capable of. The kind built on honesty and competence, rather than display." He stopped, That is precisely the kind of marriage I should like to have, if the woman in question will have it with me. She did not say yes immediately, and I am glad of it. An immediate yes would have been the answer of a woman who had simply been waiting to be asked, and Miss Theodora Hewitt, whatever she was not that. She was a woman who had spent 7 years running a household with no authority and considerable skill, and she understood the weight of a permanent commitment better than most people who make them lightly. She asked for 2 days. He gave them without hesitation, because he understood, watching her ask, that a woman who needed 2 days to accept a Viscount was a woman who was actually going to turn up once the 2 days were finished. He spent those 2 days at the Westmere Inn, returning to Warwick's bookshop once, and this time purchasing the natural history he had not read. He found he was more unsettled about her answer than he had expected to be. Not anxious, precisely, but attentive in a way he had not been attentive about anything that was not his son in quite some time. She came to the inn on the morning of the 3rd day, walking across the village green in her grey wool coat, carrying nothing. She sat down across from him in the small private parlour, and she said, "I have one question remaining." "Ask it," he said. "Your son," she said. "William, what does he like?" He blinked. In all the conversations he had conducted over the previous year, in the pursuit of a second marriage, across every dinner table and every formal introduction and every carefully arranged meeting, no one had asked him that first. "Frogs," he said after a moment, "and maps, and being read to, though he pretends he is too old for it, which he is not." She looked at him steadily for one long moment. "Then yes," she said. They were married in December in Westmere's small parish church, and I am told that young William Dunvale attended the ceremony with a frog-shaped button in his coat pocket, which his new stepmother had sent him the week before, with a note explaining that she had read the common frog could survive the winter by slowing its own heart, which she found considerably more interesting. Most Entlo chose to embroider on handkerchiefs. "If you have been sitting with me long enough tonight that you feel you have earned a place by this fire, the membership is just below, and it costs very little, and it means more to me than I generally say out loud. You have sat through an omission in an agreement, and a bookseller's back room, and a woman who asked about frogs, before she said yes to a marriage. And I would not have been able to tell it without you at the other end. Before I leave them, and I will leave them there, in that December church, which is as good a leaving place as any, I want to give you a fair account of Miss Lavinia Hewitt, because I have not made her a villain in this story, and I do not intend to let the ending treat her as one. She was hurt. Genuinely and rather deeply, in the way of a person who has been told her whole life that her value is one particular thing, and then finds the arrangement she depended on has placed its bid somewhere else entirely. She spent the better part of 3 days in her room, and Miss Theodora sat with her through a portion of them, which I think tells you something about both sisters, about Miss Lavinia, who was not too proud to be sat with, and about Miss Theodora, who sat with her anyway. But Miss Lavinia was not, at her core, a diminished person. She was a frightened one who had been given a very narrow instruction about her own worth, and who, once the initial blow had passed, discovered in herself a resilience that narrowness had not quite managed to extinguish. She married the following spring, a young baronet from the neighbouring county, cheerful and entirely besotted, who admired her beauty without once making it a condition of his affection. She was, by all accounts, rather happier in that marriage than any arrangement with a methodical widower and his quiet small son could possibly have made her. Some temperaments are better suited to baronets than to viscounts. There is no shame in that either way. And that, my dear friends, is where I set this story down. A viscount who arrived to assess a daughter and found himself in the back corner of a bookseller's shop, accidentally listening to the only honest sentence he had heard in a year, and the woman who had spent 7 years being her household's most reliable person and its least acknowledged one. until a quiet stranger, who was carrying a book he was not reading, stood in the right place at the right moment and had the sense to recognize what he heard. If you ask me what this story is truly about, I will tell you it is about the particular cruelty of being sorted into a category by the people who ought to know you best. Sir Clifford Hewitt had 2 daughters. He had sorted them without cruelty and without much thought, the way one sorts the post, this pile for opening, this pile for setting aside. He had done it so long ago and so naturally that it had ceased to feel like a decision at all. It was simply the arrangement of things. It was simply how the household ran. It took a stranger, carrying a book he was not reading, to stand in the right place at the right moment and hear what the arrangement had cost the woman holding it together. Be careful, my dears, how you sort the people who are closest to you. The one you have decided is useful, reliable, the one who gets things done without being asked. She may be all of those things and simultaneously something else entirely. Something that your long familiarity has quietly filed away under the wrong heading. It sometimes takes a stranger's honest attention to read the label correctly. Subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood and come back to me when the fire is lit and the evening is quiet, and you are ready for another one. Every story I keep here is one I thought worth the telling, and I do love knowing who is sitting on the other side of the dark. And if you find yourself tonight, before you sleep, thinking of someone in your own life who has been sorted into the useful pile without anyone's stopping to ask whether that was quite right, do look at them again, won't you? With the honest eyes of someone who is not yet too familiar to see clearly. She is very likely still there, holding things up, waiting to be asked about the frogs. Good night.